1946. The Bryn Eglwys Slate Quarry collapses overnight, sending the last workers home for good. Its lifeline, the tiny Talyllyn Railway, so narrow and obsolete as to be almost forgotten, falls suddenly, totally silent. Its future, abandonment, decay, erasure. Yet this doomed remnant would become the world's first preserved railway, rewriting history from the edge of oblivion. How does an unglamorous Victorian branch line spark a global movement? Subscribe to find out how ordinary enthusiasts defied extinction and changed railways forever. In the decades before the Talyllyn Railway's brush with extinction, the hills above Tywyn pulsed with the promise of slate. By the 1840s, Bryn Eglwys Quarry had tunneled deep into the rock, feeding a hunger for durable roofing as cities across Britain and beyond grew at breakneck speed. But the real flood of opportunity came not from Wales, but from across the Atlantic. When the American Civil War erupted in 1861, cotton shipments to Lancashire's mills dried up almost overnight. Investors, cut adrift by the cotton famine, turned their attention and capital toward Welsh slate, an industry suddenly flush with demand and eager for expansion. Among those with vision and means was William McConnell, an industrialist from Manchester. He saw the bottleneck. Horse-drawn carts could not keep up with the quarry's growing output. Slate piled up, waiting for a way out of the valley. In April 1864, McConnell secured the land rights for a railway, determined to connect Bryn Eglwys to the coast at Tywyn. He moved quickly, and by June 30th, 1865, an Act of Parliament had authorized the Talyllyn Railway, one of the first in Britain to grant a narrow-gauge line the right to carry not just slate, but passengers as well. The commercial logic was clear. Slate exports were climbing, with Wales shipping hundreds of thousands of tons each year by the 1870s. The new railway promised to turn remote hillsides into a vital artery of industry, moving stone from darkness to daylight, from quarry face to distant rooftops. McConnell's gamble set the stage for a railway that, though born of profit and necessity, would one day be rescued for reasons no Victorian investor could have imagined. Steel rails threaded the Fathu Valley not on the broad shoulders of the main line, but on a slender path only 2 feet 3 inches wide, an oddity even by the standards of Victorian engineering. William McConnell's choice of this 686mm gauge was more than a cost-saving measure. Narrow rails meant sharper curves, less earth to move, and a railway that could snake through dense woods and hug the river's edge, reaching the slate where larger lines could not. This decision set the Talyllyn apart from the very start, giving it a character both practical and peculiar. The line's first locomotives, Talyllyn and Dolgoch, arrived from Fletcher, Jennings and Company in 1864 and 1866. Each engine was a mechanical experiment, squat, sturdy, and adapted to the steep gradients and tight bends of the valley. Talyllyn, with its saddle tank and short wheelbase, looked almost toy-like, but carried slate and men with determined regularity. Dolgoch, fitted with sidewater tanks and a unique valve gear, would later become the backbone of the railway's survival. Running passengers on such a narrow track was almost unheard of in Britain at the time. When inspectors arrived in 1866, they demanded changes. Rails shifted for safer clearance, rolling stock modified to prevent mishaps, brakes and guards added to carriages. Only after these adjustments did the Talyllyn become one of the earliest narrow-gauge steam railways in the country to carry passengers by legal right. These technical firsts, born of necessity and negotiation, left the railway with quirks that would haunt its future. Every bolt and rivet, every inch of track carried the stamp of improvisation, a legacy that would challenge and later inspire generations of caretakers. Morning in the Fathu Valley began with the whistle of steam and the shuffle of boots on gravel. For the quarrymen of Abergynolwyn, the Talyllyn Railway was more than a line on a map. It was the start and end of every working day. 7 miles of narrow track stitched their village to Tywyn's bustling wharf, carrying slate down to the sea and bringing supplies, parcels, and news back up from the coast. Mixed trains rumbled through the woods, slate wagons clattering behind carriages, where men in heavy boots swapped stories or dozed beneath their caps. In summer, the faces changed. Families from England and the Midlands filled the little coaches, pressed to the windows as the train wound past waterfalls and sheep-dotted hillsides. Children counted tunnels and waved at the engine crew, while locals watched the valley's rhythms shift with the seasons. The railway's timetable was a patchwork of quarry shifts and holiday excursions, with passenger and freight cars coupled together in a single procession. Milk churns waited at flag stops, letters and groceries added to the cargo. For the people of the valley, the Talyllyn was lifeline and meeting place, a constant thread binding work, home, and hope. Its loss was unthinkable, not just an end to movement but the unraveling of daily life. Slate fortunes, once the lifeblood of the Fathu Valley, began to ebb as the 20th century wore on. Cheaper roofing materials crowded the market, and the great export booms of the Victorian era faded into distant memory. By 1910, Bryn Eglwys Quarry's output had fallen by half, and the railway's future looked increasingly fragile. Wages shrank, and the steady rhythm of trains that once signaled prosperity now hinted at something more desperate, a line running on borrowed time. Into this uncertainty stepped Haydn Jones, a local Liberal member of Parliament with a keen sense of duty to his community. In 1911, Jones purchased the quarry, the railway, and the entire village of Abergynolwyn, not as a business venture, but as an act of stewardship. His decision was driven less by profit than by the need to preserve nearly 200 jobs and to hold together the fabric of a valley threatened by economic collapse. Parliamentary speeches from the time record his arguments for employment over earnings, while quarrymen's accounts recall relief mixed with doubt about how long the lifeline could last. The railway, now tethered to a declining industry and a single man's resolve, limped into the interwar years. Seasonal tourists helped fill the gaps left by shrinking slate orders, but every passing year brought fresh reminders that the old guarantees had vanished. By the 1940s, the Talyllyn's survival depended on little more than hope, habit, and the stubborn will of its caretaker owner. By 1948, the Talyllyn Railway stood alone in a landscape stripped of certainty. The nationalisation of Britain's railways swept up nearly every line in the country, but the Talyllyn was left out, its name missing from the schedules, its fate ignored by the new British railways. It remained a private concern, technically independent but utterly isolated, with no access to public funds or national support. The slate quarry that had once justified its existence was silent, its workforce scattered, and the rails themselves rusting in the damp valley air. Ownership rested with Haydn Jones, whose resolve had kept the line running through years of decline. But when he died in July 1950, the railway entered a legal void. No company board, no national body, not even a local council claimed responsibility. Lady Haydn Jones, his widow, shut the line that autumn, unable to justify repairs or risk further losses. For months, the Talyllyn existed in limbo, unclaimed, unwanted, and dangerously close to being dismantled for scrap. With no clear path forward, the future of the world's first passenger-authorized narrow-gauge railway hung by a thread, its survival dependent on a loophole and a rapidly closing window of opportunity. L.T.C. Rolt arrived at Tywyn in 1949, notebook in hand, and found the Talyllyn in a state of mechanical exhaustion. The rails wandered out of alignment, the track bed sagged underfoot, and the locomotive Talyllyn's boiler was so thin with age that even the most optimistic engineer called it beyond repair. Yet Rolt saw something worth saving. He wrote to the Birmingham Post, calling for volunteers to rescue the railway, a radical idea in an era when abandoned lines were stripped for scrap without a second thought. The response was immediate and determined. By September 1951, the Talyllyn Railway Preservation Society had formed, gathering a band of engineers, railwaymen, and enthusiasts with little more than hope and borrowed tools. They began with the basics, relaying track where the original gauge had drifted by nearly half an inch, shimming rails and tightening bolts by hand. The work was slow, muddy, and often improvised. Dolgoch, the only serviceable engine, pulled the first volunteer trains, but its workload was unsustainable. Relief came from an unexpected source. Two locomotives, Sir Haydn and Edward Thomas, arrived from the closed Corris Railway, their wheel profiles a near match for Talyllyn's quirky gauge. With these engines, the volunteers could keep trains running while overhauling their own battered fleet. Each milestone, every length of new rail, every boiler patched, turned the vision of a preserved railway into a living, breathing reality. Against all odds, the line reopened to passengers in May 1951, not as a relic or museum piece, but as a working railway run entirely by volunteers. Talyllyn endures not as a monument, but as a living rebellion against oblivion. Every whistle, every volunteer shift defies the logic of decline. In a world where heritage too often vanishes, its survival proves that ordinary passion can rewrite what history leaves behind. Share your thoughts below.